Hi, I'm Pam Killeen, and welcome to my podcast, Circadian Reboot, where we discuss everything circadian. And today I'm pleased to announce that I have a very special guest on the show. Her name is Sarah Pugh. She holds a background in genetics, biochemistry, and a PhD in biophysics. She has worked extensively in blue lit labs researching protein folding, fluorescence, imaging, dopamine receptors, genetic promoters in moss, statins, cholesterol, and heart cells. Later, Sara trained in functional movement, Pilates, hypnosis, functional neurology, ketogenic diets, and quantum biology. Since 2010, she has been helping clients overcome their pains and problems by examining their history and current lifestyle through a variety of different lenses. She excels at translating complex scientific concepts into accessible, practical advice, empowering people to improve their health and well-being. Her primary focus is on quantum and circadian biology, studying how quantum physics, particularly light, plasma, water, gravity, hydrogen, deuterium, and magnetism, control biology and how we are bioelectromagnetic beings. In addition to her scientific expertise, Sara has a spiritual side. She has explored Christian mysticism, Kabbalah, biogeometry, and ancient religious practices alongside the study of medicinal plants. With advancements in plasma physics, she believes many ancient perspectives on consciousness were remarkably accurate. Sara approaches the world through multiple lenses, recognizing that no one-size-fits-all method exists, and tailors her approach to each individual's unique life story. Hi, Sara. Thank you so much for joining me on my podcast, Circadian Reboot. I'm thrilled to have you here today because you are definitely a very, very seasoned scientist. You've had published papers, you've explored all sorts of different areas of health, including studying cholesterol and statins. And I just want to talk to you, first of all, about that. You say that you are questioning everything, that you're discovering a new lie every single day. And if we start with cholesterol and statins, you've done a tremendous amount of digging in that area. And I wonder what you've discovered with regards to statins and cholesterol and how that story can relate to toxic lighting versus healthy light via the sunlight.
Okay, so the relationship between cholesterol and light. So first of all, with cholesterol, it's something that the body makes itself, and it wouldn't make something that was harmful to us. And it's extremely misunderstood, and it kind of gets demonized, a bit like the sun. And because there's sort of money involved in medication or sunscreens or sunglasses, there's a particular narrative that's attached to these, say, a molecule or the sun, and it can be very misleading for people because of course cardiovascular disease is very serious, but interestingly the sunlight offers so many benefits. But when it comes to hearts, it's a really good regulator of calcium in the heart. Also, people may or may not know that we make vitamin D out of cholesterol, and that only happens in sunlight. So this idea of the sun trying to kill us is so far from the truth. And the same with the cholesterol. All it's doing, it's just the body's making it because we need to use cholesterol to make things like our sex hormones, which are estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone. And also there's another pathway. Well, there's many pathways involved with cholesterol. We mentioned vitamin D, which I think is something really important, especially for your audience. And cholesterol is also an anti-inflammatory agent, something, again, you mentioned a lot of your people suffer from inflammation. And there's cholesterol in the skin can act as a defense against invaders. I could go on all day about all of the benefits of cholesterol, but also there are lots of studies on what happens when people have low cholesterol. They can have depression, dementia, violent behavior. And again, lack of sunlight is attributed to so many different situations, from cancer to depression, to obesity, to tiredness, to insomnia. So I think there's parallels between cholesterol and the sun, and this idea of the fear mongering and preventing people going out in the sun for really important levels of healing, which we're probably going to talk about in depth in this conversation, but not in depth scientifically, more giving people tools of how to use nature, how to use the sun, and how it can help them.
Right. And so when people today go to a doctor, they want an easy solution. And a lot of that could be around, taking statin medications. So they walk out of the office and they're pleased because they got a quick fix solution. But you kind of shock and awe your patients, don't you? You tell them something completely unheard of, and it gets them intrigued in terms of what the next step is. So rather than recommending or putting people on statins or encouraging them to be on statins, what do you tell them to do?
To get more sunlight and to limit their artificial light exposure and exposure to other non-natural electromagnetism. Because in the past, if we look back in the 1930s and the 1920s, that was literally what doctors used to tell patients to do if they were unwell, was to get more sunshine. Whereas nowadays, the doctor themselves sits in artificial light all day, and they are obliged to prescribe certain medications, be it statins or antidepressants or a whole myriad of drugs, whereas actually you can use sunlight to correct all of these situations as well.
Yeah, and your patients are quite happy. They say, "Well, you didn't change my diet. You told me to do something I've never heard of doing before." And they go out and they try, and obviously within a few days, I'm hearing reports that people start feeling better.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Because I sometimes say to people, if you're not outside, where are you? And they're going to be insulated from the earth and away from nature. They're going to be surrounded by electricity, be it the mains or their phone or Wi-Fi. And they're inside under LEDs, in front of blue lit screens with windows shut. And it's sort of as far removed from nature as you can imagine.
And there's a strong connection. I know when people go to doctors and they get their statins, they also get metformin. So there seems to be a connection between blood sugar control and cholesterol. And maybe you can speak to that. I know you know quite a bit about blood sugar, diabetes, and so on, and its relationship to light. So it's funny how everything here is all connected to light.
Oh, yeah, definitely, because artificial blue light raises blood sugar, cortisol, and insulin. And cortisol is a stress hormone, but it also is very important for our energy levels and keeping us alive. So, cortisol, we die without it, but when it's dysregulated, either too much of it when people are stressed or none at all when people have got end stage adrenal fatigue. And too much, well, being exposed to artificial blue light raises people's blood sugar and insulin, and that can lead to things like insulin resistance. And for a long time, we know the link between insulin resistance and inflammation. And when it comes to food and cholesterol, you can actually make cholesterol out of all sorts of things. People think it's just made from fat, but the actual pathway, you could make cholesterol out of protein, out of sugar. And when people have abnormal lipids, it's the triglycerides in their blood tests that people should be looking at, not things like LDL. HDL is very important because I don't want to say good and bad cholesterol because there's only one kind of cholesterol. Because when we talk about cholesterol, we're actually referring to lipids or lipoproteins that happen to have cholesterol in them, but they also have other roles in the body, like carrying fat soluble vitamins around. And I think this idea of cholesterol being bad, it began in the 1950s with Ansel Keys, and to me now it's just so ridiculous. It's the biggest red herring of all, and it's not the people. A lot of the time people are looking the wrong way. They want a boogeyman to blame, and it's not cholesterol. Whereas something like artificial blue light that raises blood sugar and cholesterol and insulin, everybody agrees that dysregulated blood sugar, high cortisol is really bad for health. Yet what's being done about it, just giving people metformin isn't the solution. It's just putting a band-aid on it. And 100%, I think diet is important, but it's not complicated at all. It's just eat whole foods. That's where people can begin. I know we're not probably going to be talking about that, but I just wanted to add that there, that diet does matter, but it's not as complicated as it's made out on social media.
I agree. And I think you talk a lot about keto, the keto diet, and you teach people, of course, not to be fearful of animal foods, which includes animal fat. And this helps at many different levels. It helps increase energy in the body. It helps probably regulate another modality people can use to regulate their blood sugar. So it probably helps at several different levels. I know you talk about deuterium as well, and that's a big, long, fancy word. But animal foods would have less deuterium. So maybe you can speak to some of those factors there as well.
Okay, so when we eat food, there's quite a long process, and it ends up in something called our mitochondria, and they make energy for us, but in the form of deuterium depleted water or metabolic water, and they also make ATP or adenosine triphosphate. But just for simplicity, today, the mitochondria make energy, so we want to make sure that the information in our food and the light information that we get all matches. So the mitochondria, the food is one aspect, but the light is also energy and for the body as well. So when it comes to something like deuterium, it is a fancy word, and it's basically an isotope of hydrogen. So it's a big hydrogen. And inside the mitochondria, there's a little machine called, or nano machine called the ATPase, and it works with a hydrogen, a small one going down. Whereas if a deuterium tries to go down that ATPase, it's like an adult going on a child's slide or a child's bike or something. It's going to break it because it's too big. So when we talk about deuterium, it does occur naturally. I don't want people to think it's something harmful. It's only harmful when it's in excess. And if we are consuming something that's damaging our mitochondria, it's straight away going to be affecting our ability to make energy. And if we can't make energy, we basically can't heal, we can't relax, we can't enjoy life, we can't run processes in the body. So that's one reason why deuterium's a problem, but also because it's bigger than hydrogen. And I mentioned the mitochondria make water, and our water battery that's powered by sunlight is fundamentally our energy source. And when we have deuterium in our water battery, it behaves in a different way to hydrogen, so it makes our battery not as efficient. So just in simple terms, the more deuterium you have, the more of a burden it is on the body, and the more it's going to slow you down. And when it comes to very high deuterium foods, the highest would be things like seed oils, which are synthetic. And then things like collagen supplements and a few other supplements have got a lot of deuterium in them because they've been made in the factory. And then things like carbohydrates, sort of tropical fruit and very sweet fruit, that's got a lot of deuterium. But the point with this is those kind of fruits grow somewhere where there's a lot of sunlight. And like I was saying before, we need to match the light in our environment with the food and the light that we put into the body. So eating something like a pineapple in Canada or the UK would be completely inappropriate because it's the wrong kind of food for that light environment. And also a pineapple would have lots of deuterium in it. So it's not going to be a problem if you live in Costa Rica, but eating lots of pineapples in the UK or Canada would be a big mismatch. But again, that's a natural food. So it's not to fear fruit or anything. You just want to make sure you eat it seasonally and locally. Then back to very high deuterium foods, processed foods from factories contain a lot of deuterium as well, but also the information in those kind of foods is very confusing to the body. And when we confuse our body, it creates chaos, which is just a biophysics word for inflammation. And any kind of chronic illness, as we said before, is associated with insulin resistance, but it's also associated with inflammation. So the more confusing information we give our body, the more chaos we get and the more inflammation we get. Also, if we overload our mitochondria and our body with deuterium, it's going to, like I said, damage the mitochondria, which is going to later on kill them, but they're going to set off an alarm signal, which would be inflammation and uncontrolled free radicals, because free radicals are not bad if they're appropriate, but too much causes inflammation. So another problem with deuterium is it creates more inflammation in a person. And then the way in which deuterium works, it sort of slows things down and blocks things up. And Dr. Gabor Chomely has done quite a lot of work on this about how deuterium can lead to insulin resistance and diabetes. And also people like Dr. Laszlo Boros, he's a very famous deuterium researcher. He's done many podcasts and been an author on papers talking about how deuterium can encourage things like insulin resistance. So we can already see deuterium's ticking lots of boxes that would be a problem for, say, somebody who had low energy or just general dysfunction in the body. And we've talked about sort of the food aspect. Just looping back to a keto diet again, things that are low in deuterium are all fats, excluding the seed oils, and then protein is sort of in between carbohydrates and fats, although generally our protein consumption has sort of stayed about the same, and then the levels of fats and sugars that we've been told to eat by the establishment have changed. So when people were told sort of from the 1960s onwards to eat low fat and high carb, that's obviously going to be a high deuterium diet. And also with the advent of aeroplanes and changes in farming, it's possible to ship bananas and pineapples all around the world, whereas back in the sort of earlier part of the century, and even in the 60s and 50s, people would have eaten more seasonally and locally, naturally. I think my dad probably didn't see a banana until he was about 10, and they would have just eaten what would have been growing locally. So just this rise in deuterium is one contributing factor to chronic disease, but also this fear of sunlight and people are not going outside as much. This has caused this increase since the 50s of chronic disease, because there are a lot of graphs available, and we can just see by looking around, something's happening in the environment to make chronic disease rise and rise and rise. And it's not just one factor. You can trace it back to changing the soles of the shoes, that people used to wear leather-soled shoes, which is grounding, so we can draw electrons, which is a form of energy in the body in, and now we have rubber-soled shoes, and there's a correlation between that and chronic disease. The introduction of seed oils, that caused an increase in disease. The invention of the LED and blue lit screens, that's also contributed to it. Getting rid of things like incandescent light bulbs, which emitted a mixture of coloured light, including infrared and near infrared. And then, of course, would be the introduction of Wi-Fi and mobile phones and technology. So we've got like beyond just a trifecta of problems, we've got like a multi-pronged attack on our biology. So we can see why there's this increase in chronic disease. But the good thing about everything I've mentioned, the individual's able to do something about all of those factors, and it basically is a way to give people control of their life again, because we can choose what kind of shoes we wear, we can walk around barefoot, we can choose to avoid seed oils, we can choose to eat an animal and seafood based diet and include seasonal and local fruit. We control what we do on our mobile phones. Sure, people need to communicate, but we don't need to be scrolling on the phones at 11 p.m. at night. We can choose to open windows, to go outside, to not wear sunglasses and sun cream and things like that. So luckily, if we adopt a circadian lifestyle, all of a sudden a huge amount of control has come back to our lives, because it's very terrifying for people with chronic problems not understanding why has this happened. And as soon as a solution is presented that's logical, has science behind it, it gives people not just hope as in hopium, it actually gives people the power to be able to regain their health. And the good thing about a lot of this is it's free as well.
Yes, yeah. And a lot of people are using infrared saunas and cold, and these things actually also help remove the deuterium from the body as well, as I understand.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think when we talk about deuterium depletion, I'm always about there's going to be deuterium coming in, and then there's ways to get deuterium out. So the first thing, it's the same with heavy metals and things. You've got to find out where they're coming from, because if you just keep depleting and putting more back in, you're not solving the problem. And that's correct that sweating, because we're going to sweat out water, which is going to have deuterium in it, that will deplete deuterium. And then cold thermogenesis, that's going to deplete deuterium in a slightly different way. And then, of course, I mentioned hotter countries closer to the equator, there's naturally more deuterium there, but within the environment, there's a lot more UV, there's a lot more high energy sunlight. So people have got the ability to deplete the deuterium in their environment. That's why those kind of fruit grow in Costa Rica and people would eat them and not get sick. Whereas if they were eating them in the UK, where we don't have sufficient sort of sunlight to match the deuterium level in say the fruit, it would be problematic. And then when it comes to saunas, the infrared light or the sun, that's the light that comes out of the sun is about 50% red light, and the near infrared light's really important for structuring or our water in the body. So that would just be a simple way of saying we make exclusion zone water that's charge separated. So it basically makes a battery, and this particular battery that now we know about mitochondria and water, that the light from the sun can charge this battery. But then, of course, you can use red light panels, you can use saunas as well to improve this exclusion zone water. Cold thermogenesis does a lot more, actually, because it's going to do things like improving insulin sensitivity, improving leptin sensitivity, because leptin is a hormone that not just controls appetite and body weight, it controls sex hormones, bone metabolism, the immune system, and this is driven by light. But also insulin and leptin have a relationship with the cold, because that's another way in which people can get insulin resistant, is just being inside all the time with the temperature the same, because we're designed, especially in the northern hemispheres like Canada, the northern states, the UK, to have seasons or seasonality. So just being at the same temperature all the time is not good for metabolism, because we make something called brown fat, which is metabolically active fat, and this is activated by the cold. So cold thermogenesis has got lots of benefits for insulin resistance that we've talked about already, and then leptin resistance, which sort of ties into things like obesity, fertility problems, immune system problems. And the other thing which cold thermogenesis does that's important, which we haven't talked about yet, is it encourages neurotransmitter production, because a lot of people find cold thermogenesis can help with addictions, depression, and things like that. But also sunlight is brilliant for helping with addictions and mood as well.
And how do you recommend people start with something like cold thermogenesis? I enjoy being in the cold water, but I have trouble getting into the cold water. Have you got any tricks to encourage people to do the cold thermogenesis and maybe start slowly, maybe with by splashing it on their face or something, some sort of trick like that?
Yeah, so it's massive, the cold thermogenesis, because first of all, it would just be turning the heating down and opening windows, and then wearing less clothes. Instead of jumping out of the shower and just drying with a towel, if you let yourself dry in the air, that's going to be some kind of cold thermogenesis, because basically anything below body temperature is cold thermogenesis. And then people who've got things like severe adrenal fatigue or thyroid disease, they have to be a bit careful with cold plunges and ice baths straight away. Cryotherapy is a better option there. But then for home use, but when we are exposed to cold air and even a cold shower, that's, even though there's water there, it's still a lot of air. It's not the same degree of heat or cold transfer as we would by cold immersion. So those were things to do with air exposure. Like just go for somebody who hasn't been outside without 3 coats on or something, on scarves, take the scarf off, because our brown fat sort of in this area here at the front of the chest and also in our upper back. So we want to expose that area to the cold, and we can do it sort of with the air first of all. Then the next thing people would probably do would be to have cold showers. But on the other hand, some people might want to just make a bath that's sort of something like sort of in the 65-ish Fahrenheit, sort of 25 degrees C-ish. And just, they might want to go straight into getting into cold water, but they don't have to add loads and loads of ice the first time. They could just run a bath with cold water and just get in that. So there's the amount that people can do with cold thermogenesis is massive. And then I suppose in the summertime or even in the fall, some people might want to swim in the sea or swim in a lake. So it's basically endless of how much.
Yeah.
People don't need to always invest $10,000 into one of these cold plunges, because that might be out of someone's budget. I would say cold is probably one of the easiest things for people to implement at home, because there's just numerous options.
Good. That's excellent. And now you're also a big fan of intermittent fasting, or timed eating. Can you talk about why that is and how you might do it in your life?
Okay, so with fasting, there's lots of reasons why it can be beneficial. And first of all, snacking too often can disturb the clocks in the body, the liver clock. So people can get dysregulated blood sugar and sort of wake up in the night hungry and things like that. Also, digesting anything in the gut's inherently inflammatory. So just giving the gut a rest for a bit is very helpful for people. Then as we increase the duration of fasting, the body does something called autophagy, which is just clearing out the trash of sort of old and damaged cells and organelles. So that can be helpful for sort of housekeeping in the body. But just to note that with fasting, if somebody's very leptin resistant and they've got terrible sort of sex hormones, they're full of cortisol, fasting's going to actually be a bit too stressful for them. So they would need to correct their leptin and their hormones first before diving into fasting, because that's the problem with people. They sometimes are so keen to get better. They think they have to do everything now, like they have to do cold, they have to do fasting, and they're adding stress on top of stress. So I would say that before embarking on the fasting, it's always better to have your circadian rhythm good, because that's the basic fundamentals of everything, the timing in the body, and then making sure the hormones are as optimized as possible, and then add fasting, because for some people it can be too stressful straight away, and other people who've had eating disorders in the past, if they haven't corrected the root of that, because some eating disorders are due to the wrong exposure up to light, and like I said before, light and grounding in the environment provide 60% of our energy. So if people are not aware they can get energy from the environment and their sole focus is all around food, when people start sort of denying themselves food by fasting, and the body was already under pressure or threatened, it's thinking, oh, you're starving me, so it'll backfire. So with fasting, I think it's brilliant, but it's horses for courses. It's one of these things that there are certain people who need to correct other things first of all, and then I think fasting's like a superb tool to add into a sort of daily
Yeah.
life.
So for those who are really, really sick, then you recommend starting with light, and that would be waking up in the morning and looking at the sunrise, for example, sky gazing throughout the day, wearing blue light blockers. These types of modalities are probably the most important things to start with. Is that right?
Oh yeah, definitely, because light drives the amount of chemical reactions in our body. It's sort of billions per second, and the only thing that's got the right biophysical properties to act as sort of the modulator and the switchboard would be light. And also our basic biology is programmed on light and dark, and like I was saying before, if people's body clocks or circadian rhythms out of whack, so are all of their biological processes, be it digestion, be it when they make hormones, be it when they make neurotransmitters. So it's much better to get the timing right in the body, because it's a bit like an airport. It couldn't run properly if everything wasn't on time. So wouldn't be any point buying giant jumbo jets for an airport if the timing that was happening in the airport was terrible. It's the same with a person, that fixing the circadian rhythm so that everything happens on time. Because like I said before, when things are all disordered in the body, it creates chaos, which creates inflammation. So it makes sense to go for the low-hanging fruit. So that would be, like you mentioned, seeing the sunrise, because that sets the master clock in the body. Because throughout the day, our body clocks drift, and every morning they need to be like reset. So that's why we see the sunrise. There's also a lot more to the sunrise, which I won't go into, but for the sake of today, it's really important for setting the body clock for the day. Then it would be eating breakfast, because that reinforces that it's morning time. Then after the sunrise, we've got something called the UVA rise, when the ultraviolet A light comes out. And UVA is really important for making dopamine, serotonin, and the serotonin gets turned into melatonin later for sleeping. So we actually can decide, are we going to have a good night's sleep by getting good exposure to morning light. And also the other important thing about UV light is it makes melanin, and that's another source of energy in the body. It's not just a suntan. Melanin can absorb all different frequencies of light and other things in the electromagnetic spectrum. It can also absorb toxins and heavy metals, but melanin can also split water to make hydrogen and electrons, so there's more energy for us, and it's the UV light we need to get exposed to make melanin. Also, when we make melanin, there's the hormone that makes melanin, alpha MSH, is also an appetite suppressant. So like I was saying before, that we can, if we're out in the sun, we're gathering energy from the sun. So our body's naturally going to temper down our appetite for food because we're gathering energy from the sun. Then I mentioned vitamin D earlier, and if people have looked in the research, vitamin D is tied into so many different, or deficiency of vitamin D is tied into everything from cancer, immune problems, appetite problems. And the vitamin D that we make about 20 different forms. And the supplement is something totally different. The vitamin D supplement's made in a factory, and it's a storage form of vitamin D anyway, so it's inferior. So the UVB light comes out probably, I'd say there's the most of it around noon. And then, like you were saying before, seeing the light regularly through the day helps to keep our body clocks in sync. And then we've got some afternoon ultraviolet light. And like I mentioned before, the ultraviolet's important for our neurotransmitters, regulating appetite in the afternoon. And then we have the sunset. So that seeing the sunset will help the body, things like the pancreas, the gut, the liver, and everything start to wind down. Because biology is very slow. It doesn't tend to do things just like that. It needs a bit of time to get ready. So that's why the thing that we have to help us know, or our biology know, when the thing's going to be happening is the sun. So that's it, sort of very briefly how somebody could set up themselves a circadian day. And I hadn't, and you
Now, how do
mentioned.
you, oh, I'm sorry. How do you help people overcome their fear of the sun? This is a big thing. I mean, people are hearing this saying, "Oh no, the sun's going to get me. I might need it for my health, but it's going to, be counterproductive because of all this propaganda we've heard."
I think also it's the combination of sitting in blue light all day and then getting sunburned as a surprise. Yes, that could be harmful. But also it's about, with people overcoming a fear, it's basically, I just say to people, whatever you're doing isn't right because you're still sick. So therefore you have to consider, the science, but also it's common sense that how can the sun possibly be harming when it's the thing that creates all food and life on the planet? And it's about educating people, explaining the different parts of the sun. Like, for example, say with melanoma or burning, you can't possibly get burnt or melanomas from the sunlight in the morning because there isn't any UV light anyway. So it's the most healing time of the day. It's like a red light panel. What's the point of buying a red light panel when there's a great big giant red light panel out there that's free? And then a lot of people suffer from depression and sort of mental health problems. So if you explain to them, we need ultraviolet light to make dopamine for mood. And if you look at the biology of what dopamine's made out of, it's very clear it's a UVA active pathway. If we explain to people about how important vitamin D is and that the supplement isn't the same as what you make, it starts to become clear that the sun is this very important healing thing. And also I still say to people, if you're not outside in the sun, what's the alternative? Sitting around artificial blue light, which there's about 35 years of research now showing it causes cancer, diabetes, obesity, depression, acne, all sorts of things. So what do you want? To sit it around man-made stuff or sit outside in intelligent design? I think maybe as I've got older, I've got less patience with people, and I just kind of have to just say it as it is. And I think, as I was said, if people are still sick, they're obviously doing something wrong. I don't say it in a nasty way. I think it's just people have to be educated, and I think that's why these podcasts that you're doing are really important, that people can be educated and then they can start to understand how these different wavelengths of light offer benefits to problems that they've got, because all the things we've talked about are the top 10 common health complaints of people, and the sun and being away from artificial light and artificial non-native EMFs, which are just an invisible form of light we can't see. It just seems sort of common sense to me. And if you go around and look at the animals and what they do, like my cat and my dog, as soon as there's sun, they'll shoot out and lie and go grounded in the sun, and then they'll come in the shade when they get a bit hot. So it's just about watching what does nature do, and it's not afraid of the sunlight. And also, you can't grow if you put a big black plastic bag over your plants, then they're not going to grow, and you're not going to grow roses or figs or lemons or whatever it was you're trying to grow. So it's clear that the sun provides something that gives life.
Yeah, generally speaking, I don't burn and I'm fair. But in the spring, you just sort of gradually build up your tolerance for the sun. If people are really sun phobic and they're hearing this and they want to go out in the sun, it's the same thing. You really have to start off and be very wise about it. Nobody wants you to get burned,
Oh yeah.
but you can build what's called the solar callus and
Oh,
gradually
exactly.
build
Yeah,
up,
that's why seeing
your
the
skin.
sunrise.
Yeah.
Yeah, seeing the sunrise is vital. That's where people start, because it's all about the timing. And if you expose your body to morning sun and the sunrise, it prepares the body for receiving the UV later. And if you wear sunglasses, that makes your brain think it's pitch black, so it's not ready for the UVB. So it's all about, sort of safe sun exposure regularly. And I completely agree. People don't need to just rush out now and lie in a sort of really hot sun for 5 hours if they've not been in the sun for years and years. And also with the solar callus, there's another level to it as well, because the way that the sunlight works in the body, we need electrons. So people would need to be grounded, because that draws in electrons, because the sun excites electrons, and excited electrons is what powers the body. Because the other fundamentally important thing that people don't understand is physics drives biology. Everything's physics, not biology. So photons, electrons, deuterium, hydrogen, that's what we are really. And you can even Google this, and Google will tell you that you're 0.0001% matter. So there's huge amounts of physics to explain to people why going outside is so important. Yet we just seem to live in a biology paradigm, and people think everything's biology. But then big pharma and stuff, obviously they're a biology producing company, so you have to think, okay, who's the person telling everybody that everything's supplements or biology or biochemistry? Of course big pharma don't want people to start thinking through a physics lens, because it would completely obliterate their business and their narrative. But unfortunately, that's how we work. Everything's physics. And like I was saying before, the photons from the sun charging our electrons, and nobody disagrees that we're like an electric being. We've known this for over 100 years. It's just for some reason people can't seem to see out of the box that they're stuck in.
Right, and they think they're getting electrons from taking antioxidants, when really what you're saying is get your electrons from the outdoors. And where you touched on grounding earlier, and what do you do for grounding? Like, you go out barefoot, and is there a certain amount of time that you ground, or how regularly do you recommend doing it?
Okay, so just to backtrack, because with antioxidants, you can't change the redox potential of cells with supplements, but things like DHA that come from seafood, they can provide electrons. So there are certain foods that actually provide electrons, and then things like alcohol, which is an oxidizing agent, that'll steal electrons. And also sitting around tech, that's going to collapse our water battery, and then that makes us lose electrons as well. So it's like the deuterium. We want to think about, okay, what's stealing our electrons, and we can stop doing that. And then what can we do to get more electrons? So when it comes to grounding, any part of your skin touching somewhere outside, like grass or concrete, or touching your leaves or your flowers, that's going to connect you to a pathway which we can absorb electrons from. And it's a bit like the sunlight. If you're not grounding, then you must be inside, insulated from the earth. So what I say to people, you can never do too much grounding, and the more the better. But then when people are first starting, you just do as much as you can. And you can always buy grounding shoes, and then every time you go for a walk, you're going to be more connected to nature. And also, if somebody's just driven in a car or been on an aeroplane and really dissociated from nature, the best thing they can go and do would be to ground. So I just think, if possible, whenever people are outside, if they're grounded as well, it's going to be an extra bonus.
Yes, exactly. And you touched on being in an airplane. So many people who travel come home and they get sick,
Oh yeah.
and they want to blame it on air quality in the plane, or maybe the food or the water they drank on the plane. But I suppose there's a big component where it has to do with the loss of electrons, correct?
Oh yeah, and also it's like an EMF central, and it's just, if you look around the airport, it's just full of blue light. It's like Las Vegas almost, because obviously blue light steals our dopamine, and people are more likely to eat the rubbish food in the airport, and it's sort of full of like terrible food, and also they want us to buy everything in duty free. So the best way to do that is to use loads of artificial blue light to tank our dopamine so we don't have any willpower. And then of course there's the like crazy amounts of non-native EMF. It's stressful. Then yeah, being away from the ground is going to be a problem, but also there's a much more there's a deeper sort of physical side, physics side to this, of defying the laws of sort of time travel, that we've, humans are not meant to travel at sort of 500 miles an hour. So we've got to locations that we couldn't normally. So we've got the jet lag aspect from changing time zones. And just looping back to circadian biology, having a rubbish circadian rhythm is like having jet lag all the time. So
Yeah.
we've all experienced jet lag, and people's blood sugar goes all over the place, and they can't sleep, and they get depressed, and they have mood outbursts, and like you said, people get ill, people get cardiovascular sort of problems, on airplanes because of the loss of the exclusion zone water. So there's basically, travel is terrible for health, and I'm not trying to tell people you mustn't travel. It's just, of everything, what's the worst possible thing you could do apart from going to Las Vegas would be flights, because it's just like everything that's bad. But on the other hand, you just have to know the best strategies to mitigate some of this damage. And with them traveling, even for people who think, oh, I don't believe in non-native EMFs or blue light, when we travel, we don't do anything. We just sit there, and yet it's the most exhausting thing you can possibly imagine. And it should be fun. You can eat it's like being in the movies on some aeroplanes, yet everybody's really stressed. So there's obviously something about the environment that makes it problematic. And people will all agree that even a big long car journey where you just sit and chat to your friend or listen to a podcast that's really interesting, it's still exhausting. So there's a massive biophysical factor just sucking your energy out from all different levels.
Yeah, and at school too, when you look at schools, my old high school, no windows, fluorescent lights. I don't know how I survived. It's just so unnatural.
Oh, absolutely. They've done some studies in Finland of when they've taken the children outside to study, the scores and the attention just goes through the roof, because that's the other thing. All this artificial light and EMFs, it steals attention and focus, and that's something massively lacking in the younger generation. People just say, oh, you've got ADHD, here's some Adderall, whereas actually it's the environment of schools. Whereas luckily I went to a really awful school that had that leaking roofs and broken windows, so some of the windows wouldn't close, so we were all exposed to plenty of light, and it was cold, and nobody had any iPads or iPhones, and you just went outside and played at break and lunchtime. But schooling nowadays it terrifies me.
Yeah. Do any schools call you to ask you for some advice in terms of improving the environment in the schools? Are
No,
you
no,
hearing
they
from them?
haven't.
No.
No, actually, I've got a friend or a colleague called Daniel White, and he's done a huge study on using blue blockers for children. He's actually about to publish a paper because he had some really shocking and amazing results about what happens when you give children blue blockers in the evening for mental health, sleep, performance at school. And I think in his next study, he's going to have 50,000 children. So he's the expert at going around and talking to schools. But then there are sort of restrictions on what, some schools, they're not allowed to change the light bulbs back to incandescents. I think some schools have a room where all the iPads and the mobile phones go, but then you have to think about, it's not fair on the teachers either to be surrounded by 30 iPhones. So I think they do some things just because the phone is so distracting. But when it comes to window opening and lights, you'd think that people would want to have better lighting, but then LEDs are slightly more energy efficient than incandescent bulbs, just because of the way they work. And then for the sake of saving a little bit of money, this is causing catastrophic health problems, because if they went back to incandescent lights that have got the red in them, that would help. And then the thing about the opening the windows, I've got no idea why people can't do that in a school. So yes, no, they've not asked me to come to a school to talk.
I'm hoping one day they contact you. What are your projects right now? What are you working on? Anything special in terms of educating people about circadian habits and so on?
Oh yeah, I'm making a course. It's just called Practical Circadian Biology, because I've made other courses where it had practical and theory, but it might have just been a little, the more I do this, the better I get at making it concise, and the more research comes out, and then the more experience I get. Because you asked a lot of questions about how long should I do this, how much, and sometimes you can tell people to go outside, do all the things we've just talked about, but they still need somebody to tell them when and how, and like make a little structure for them. And then on a sort of scientific level, I'm looking at something called a HTMA, a hair tissue mineral analysis, which has been around for probably 50 years. But while he's still alive, I'm working with Dr. Rick Malta to look at it through a circadian lens, because these HTMAs are fascinating, because it's not just about looking at mineral balance, because we haven't even touched on minerals in water in this podcast, that they can actually read your psychological and your physical health. But the way to correct these mineral issues, so it's supplements and diet at the moment, but there's only so far that you can go. So what I'm doing is sort of collecting people who've got really, really high leptin and really, really low leptin, asking them to run a few other labs, some of which we talked about, get a HTMA test, so I can start to look at how to help people improve their HTMA results using a circadian approach, because obviously high
That's
levels
exactly what I want to do too. I've been doing it for over 10 years, and it's like there's something missing in this equation. Every time I get a hair test back, it's like, why is this so different from one person to another? And I was sure it has something to do with sunlight and circadian rhythms.
Oh, absolutely. You can also do
Yeah.
deuterium as well, because stress is a big factor in psychology, that when it comes to the HTMA test, people think, oh, I just need to eat more magnesium, or, or I need to buy a copper supplement. Whereas it actually looks into psychology and stress. And because we've talked a lot about stress and inflammation and chaos and moods, there's obviously a link here. And also with leptin, when people have got low leptin, I've tended to find that they're in a sort of very big threat or stress state. And again, you're correct with the HTMAs. There are certain patterns people say, oh, that's really hard to fix, and or you'll take whereas I think you've just run out of tools. And also, I think, like, as you know yourself, the HTMAs are very cheap, and it's very sort of accessible, because people who've got chronic health problems, they can't afford £2,000 or dollars worth of complicated blood tests that might confuse you even more, whereas they can afford $120 or £99 for a HTMA. And it looks at actually a lot more than, as you know, than just blood tests. And then if you've got access to understanding about sort of circadian rhythm, there's a lot of ways to be able to correct what you see in a HTMA using circadian biology. And like we've talked about, it's not expensive. You've got to put time and effort in, which is sort of expensive in a different way, because time's a currency as well. So yeah, for certain, there's like the thing is, there's a circadian like twist on everything. Like when I look at people's labs, if I see sort of terrible blood sugar and horrible triglycerides, I don't straight away think, oh, that person's eating a load of rubbish. I might think maybe they work in an airport, or they're a hairdresser or a dentist, and they're surrounded by blue light and non-native EMFs. So there's like things you can read out of regular blood tests, and look at, like I look at blood tests through a circadian lens as well, because like our environment makes the blood test, and people can't seem to understand that, because they want to fix the numbers, and it's like, well, the numbers came from your environment, and there are loads of things that mess up blood tests, and people can go crazy trying to use supplements to change things, when actually if they change their light and their relationship with water and magnetism, a lot of these so-called problem labs or markers would go back to normal again. But like anything, the symptoms have to go away as well, because you've probably found the same, that sometimes the numbers will say a certain thing, but the person's perfectly happy. So it's not just about sort of numbers and tests and HTMAs. It has to match the complaint or the symptoms, because fundamentally that's what people want, the symptoms to go away.
Exactly, exactly. And on that note, it's a great place to start winding down. I have one last question for you to share with our listeners here is what would be your dream circadian day?
Huh, that's a really difficult one because it depends on which country. Because um, huh, let me see. Like my own, what for me to be able to do, or for if I could have the perfect client and they did what I said.
Getting out in the morning, watching the sunrise, sky gazing,
Yeah,
grounding.
I think like get up slightly before the sunrise, because there's benefits to getting something called daybreak. And then in the morning, I think it's a really good time because I'm very much into spirituality, and regardless of what people want to say about religion and blasphemy or whatever, I don't mean it like that, because it's all the same. It's like a connection to a consciousness greater than our own, and some people call that God, some people call it Allah, some people call it the universe, some people call it nature. So it's about a spiritual connection, because this is really important when it comes to sort of another level of physics, sort of things like charge collapse and coherence in the body. So I would say the morning time is very important time to practice something. And if you don't know anything about it, or if you're a particular religion, just study it in more depth and actually do it, and do it outside, because that's the other important thing about sunrise and non-native EMFs. It's a much better time in terms of how plasma physics works to do these kind of spiritual practices. And also movements, I'm massively into that. So if people did some mobility, the Tibetan rites, even if it's like 15 minutes of something like yoga or Pilates or somatic, some kind of movement that moves the fascia, because that helps us create our own electrons, and the collagen will sort of move around. And it doesn't have to be, anything dramatic. So I think movement, something sort of meditative, that revolves around gratitude, sort of connection with a consciousness greater than our own. Or I could go on for ages. So you
I
start the
know,
day
I
in
know.
a positive. And the other thing, I also don't look at your phone and read the news. Don't go and read your work emails in the morning. So I would say that's why I mentioned going out just before the sun goes up. Don't turn lights on and phones and stuff like that. Just go and make sure that the first thing that your eyes see is natural light. And then, like I was saying, that we've tipped the spirituality or the mental side, we've done some movement, then people could come in and do a cold face splash, because the cold face plunge, it releases oxytocin, and that helps to kind of embed what we just did. And then they could have their breakfast, which would be something that it would be in natural foods. Then like I said before, the ideal day, you want to also see the UV rise. And if you, and it's so varied now, because I always go for a walk in the UV. Some people sit with the windows open, they have a patio. Some people have to drive to work, so they could do it with their windows open. Then if it would be the summer around noontime, I'd want to make some vitamin D, or a decent amount of vitamin D. So that if you're naked outside, the better. Then exposing to the afternoon sun. If somebody's working throughout the day with technology, or they're inside, if they would wear blue blockers to protect their eyes, or use flux or iris from the screen, and then see the sunset if possible. In amongst all of this, as we talked about before, if you're outside getting sun, you might as well take your shoes off and ground as well. And then after sunset, to block the blue light with blue blocking glasses. Remember to cover your skin as well. And then stop the screens and the phones and the apps sort of 2.5 to 3 hours before bed. Maybe have a magnesium sulfate bath, because that's very good for sort of the exclusion zone water. And make sure the bedroom's pitch black, cool. I don't know. It's kind of, that's a really hard question, because there are so many different things that I could have said, and I think it all depends. Does a person have a family? Is it the weekend? Is it winter? Is it summer? Are they in Switzerland up a mountain, or are they in Costa Rica on a beach? And I think, I suppose,
Yeah.
in simple terms, it would just be right back to what I was saying before. If you're not outside, you're inside. So maybe the ideal circadian day would be to spend as much of it outside as possible. It's like more simple answer.
That is absolutely perfect. Everything you said is so important, and people will glean from everything that you've said today, and I'm sure learn a lot. And, start using these things gradually. Just take baby steps.
Yes, exactly. And also,
Yeah.
nobody's a bad person if they miss the sunrise or ate a cookie. That's the other thing. People try and do it perfectly. And I think I did touch on this. The person that tries to do the cold plunge, the hot tub, the red light panel, the fasting all at once, that's not helpful either. And be kind to yourself and kind to other people. And that, most importantly, be kind to yourself, because lots of people are kind to everyone else and then not to themselves. So it's all back to, I always say everything's a work in progress. And the more you do the circadian stuff, say if you do travel, you've got much more wiggle room with jet lag. And also, say if you 99% of the time always see the sunrise, if you miss it once, your body is going to deal with everything much better than somebody who's got a horrible circadian rhythm. So, it's
Exactly.
like you say, now's a great time to start, and it doesn't have to be perfect yet.
Yeah. Well, that's a great place to end, and I really appreciate your time today. I hope you can come back on the show at some point and we can talk more about your findings using the HTMA and circadian healthy habits, and we'll see what maybe we can share some notes on that.
Oh, that'll be lovely. And also, I think I'm one of your first guests, so your audience will be able to ask questions, and then we can answer things specially for them. When your podcast is released. So I'd love to come back on.
That'd be great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you for taking your valuable time to join us today. The information provided on my website, community forum, and podcast is intended for informational purposes only and should not be construed as medical advice. We are not licensed medical professionals, and the content shared here is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you are seeking health advice or have specific medical concerns, we strongly encourage you to consult with a qualified medical doctor or healthcare provider. They are trained to evaluate your individual health needs and provide personalized recommendations tailored to your unique circumstances. By accessing and using my website, participating in my member forum, or listening to my podcast, you agree to acknowledge and abide by this disclaimer. We do not assume any responsibility or liability for actions taken based on the information provided herein.